Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. My name's John Nagel, I'm Professor of Sociology. As you probably realise, I'm neither Simon Mayborn or Eddie Wasnage, although we do share the same haircut. I'm standing in as chair for the first panel of this very exciting conference. So we've got 4 very exciting papers. I'm really looking forward to this. So just do a quick introduction for our 4 speakers. First speaker today will be, I'm hoping I pronounced this correctly. Please do correct me if not. So our first speaker is Hyun Young Ha, is an assistant professor of sociology at Duke Kunshan University. Dr. Ha is a political sociologist and whose research topics are at the intersection of sectarianism, violence, and daily resistance of religious minorities in the Middle East. So her current research examines how regime transformation and subsequent changes in political and social climate in the post-2011 Arab Spring Egypt have affected Christian-Muslim relations. Our second speaker, Andrew McIntosh, who is a researcher for Salam for Democracy and Human Rights. Andrew completed his PhD at the University of Essex in media history, and his area of expertise is in media and propaganda. Third speaker is Dr. Mustafa Menshawi. So he's a postdoctoral researcher at CPAD. He holds a PhD in politics from the University of Westminster and an MA in Middle East politics from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS. His main research interests concern the interplay between discourse and politics in the Middle East. And he's worked for the London School of Economics, University of Westminster, the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies for the European Union as well. And before moving to academia, he worked as a journalist for the BBC and Al Haram Weekly. And he's been a winner of Lorenzo Natali Prize. And he's currently working on a manuscript on provisionally titled Arab First Ladies of Authoritarianism. The fourth speaker, Tariq Sadiq, did his PhD at the University of Marburg on political participation in Iran, and his research interests include authoritarian politics, social movements, and forms of statehood in Asia. So a fantastic lineup. I think we'll do kind of 15 minutes each. I'll kind of wave my hand or put a sticky virtual hand up around about kind of 10 minutes, just to let you know you've got a few minutes left. We'll go in the order in which I just introduced everybody. So I'll hand over firstly to Hyun Young Ha, 15 minutes, and then that'll give us plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. And if I could ask attendees to remain on mute until all of the talks are kind of completed, and what we can do is collect questions for the Q&A session towards the end. So with that, if I could hand over to Hyun Young Ha.
Thank you. Let me share my slide. Okay, so can everybody see my slide well and hear me? Okay, great. So thank you so much for inviting me to this interesting and very important annual conference by CPAD. So yeah, happy to share my research with you today. This paper examines how the Arab uprisings affected Christian-Muslim relations in Egypt, so focusing on Christian identity in the making. Coptic pride has been at the center of the Christian identity in Egypt, I argue, but what constitutes the Coptic pride has changed since the Arab uprisings. Many of you would remember this photo from the Tahrir Square in Egypt. And as you can see, the person on your left is holding the Quran. The Another person on the right is holding the Coptic cross. So this photo has been seen as religious unity in Egypt, which would mean the peaceful coexistence between Christians and Muslims and religious harmony in the country. So historically, when we think about the Egyptian Christians, Christians have lived harmoniously and they have coexisted with Muslims. Unlike any other countries that we would have witnessed ethnic violence or religious conflicts. In such countries like India or Northern Ireland, we do see the coexistence from this map, as you see here. So maybe the only thing that you have to focus on right now would be the red stripes, which would mean the mixed Christian and Sunni Muslims residential area, meaning that the Christians have not created a religious or ethnic enclave. Instead, they were living together with Muslims. So from my field work, I've seen that Christians and Muslims attend the same school, they use the same supermarket, same local vegetable vendors, and etc. So it is really hard to argue that the Coptic Christians have been created some kind of like separated residential areas in history. In Egypt, it's not just Christians who are not Sunni Muslims. Sunni Muslims, by the way, constitutes of the 90% of the entire Egyptian population, while about the 10%, the rest of them would be Coptic Christians. Among the Christian population, though, the 90% of it would be Orthodox Christians. And in Egypt, they also have smaller religious and ethnic groups, including Jews, Baha'is, Nubians, and other smaller groups. This graph shows that after the Arab uprisings, as you can see from here in 2011, social discrimination against religious minorities have increased in the 4 countries that experienced the regime transition, including Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. So this data, this graph is constructed based on the quantitative analysis using the round 3 of the religion and state project. Here, this is from another paper that I wrote with my co-authors, and this data, in this project, they define social discrimination as a wide range of discrimination that includes harassment, prejudice, or violence against members of minority religions by members of society who are not representatives of the government. One of the examples that I can speak about that demonstrates increased sectarian attacks against Christians in Egypt would be what happened in August 2013. After the removal of Mohamed Morsi from his office, the groups of Muslim Brotherhood members and Islamists, they got together to protest the removal in the Tahrir Square, but they were dispersed by the police and security forces. After that, over 80 churches were torched and looted across the cities, particularly in the Upper Egypt area, including Minya, Asyut, Fayoum, Giza, Suez, or Beni Suef, and also Sohag. So in these cities, we could see dozens of churches being burned and damaged by the Islamist protesters. But Christians who were interviewed by Human Rights Watch say that they were not able to get any help from the authorities, and they refused to protect Christians. When I was in my field in Cairo in 2014, it was after all these increased burnings and church burnings were happening. And so the Christians I met in one of the neighborhoods in Cairo, located in northern Cairo, talked about how they feel fearful of potential sectarian violence. And those Christians I met in this area used to ask me a lot of the same questions repeatedly, including, do you know what Coptic means? Tarifi al-Mana al-Qibti? Or have you heard of Bluebon? So I was wondering, like at first I was thinking that they are asking those questions because I'm a foreign researcher. So they wanted to make sure that I know the meanings of them. But later, after I was asked the question like several times by different Christians, I started to wonder what would that mean. So this encounter in my field and the political situations with heightened sectarian tensions made me ask these research questions. Why is it important for Copts to bring up the questions? What is Coptic pride and how is it constructed? What does it mean to emphasize their religious identity and pride in the time of uncertainty after the Arab uprisings in 2011? In this paper, I am showing the historical examinations of how the Coptic pride at the center of Coptic identity has been created historically. So first of all, so the first example would be the Sunday school movements that started in the 1930s when we see like robust Christian education, including including the history of Coptic Orthodox Church. And also the miracles and spiritual experience that Coptic Christians have experienced over time. The other aspect that I am arguing based on my ethnographic data would include the Coptic pride is in formation in a new way after the Arab uprisings, as a lot of people started to talk more about persecution and martyrdom, and also talking about they are relatively moral compared to their Muslim majority. So first of all, the historical formation of Coptic pride. Sunday school movement has started since the 1930s, and before they didn't have systematic education through the churches. So they adopted this education system through the Western missionaries and started to weigh on their particular history that goes back to the 1st century. So Coptic Christians are proud of having starting their history in Egypt from the 1st century, which is before Muslims and Arabs enter and Islam entered the country in the 7th century. So they do believe that they are the true Egyptians and the pride out of that historical fact. With the modernization, and they also wanted to reform the church with this kind of systematic Sunday school programs. And after the 1970s, with the leadership of the Pope Shenouda III, we see that the increasing number of new monasteries and monks in Egypt. So in one of the churches that I studied in the region of Cairo, I see that the Sunday school programs have been still going on, and local churches provide diverse types of education to Christians in all age groups. This was one of the activities that I observed in April. This was on Palm Sunday. And as you can see from the photo, a little boy who is riding a donkey here, like on the right side of this photo, they were walking around the room while the rest of people, the children and their parents, were chanting that celebrates the Jesus' entrance to Jerusalem. The photo on your left would show the play on the same day, like at night on the same day. So they were basically depicting how Jesus started to meet his disciples. So this kind of Sunday school programs have provided understanding of the history and also the pride based on it. Another aspect that history created Coptic pride to Christians would be the miracles. And this is the photocopy of a photo that was taken in 1968. There was the Marian apparition happened in the part of the city called Zaitun. And someone took the photo when the apparition was happening. So a lot of people, both Egyptians and foreigners, visit this church to as a pilgrimage, and they celebrate the miracle until today. One of the relevant incidents that the episode that I had during my field research would be, I visited one of the small churches in the town that I was studying, and a person approached me, asking a question to me, how did I learn about this church? And apparently he was expecting to hear that I heard about the Marian apparition happened in this church. This is a different church that I just showed you from the previous slide, but I didn't know about it. So he started to talk about the history related to the Marian apparition that happened in the 1980s, and he was very proud that his church had the Marian apparition in the past. Another episode that Christians talk widely about would be the appearance of this Bible on the river, on the river of Nile. So there's a church called St. Mary Orthodox Church in Mahdi. Oh, 2 minutes. Okay, thank you. Okay, so then let me skip this part so that I can show you a more important part of my paper. So the second, I can also go back to the slide to explain more about it. And then, but after the Arab uprisings, I see that there was a shift of discourses that constitute the Coptic pride, which would be the martyrdom and persecution in the first place. And one of the questions that I was frequently asked would be, what do you know what the blue bone would mean? And blue bone means the bruises that occurred on the back of the Christian neck when they had to carry a heavy cross during a certain time or a certain time period of the Ottoman Empire. So the bruises, whoever has the bruise on their neck, on their back of their neck, they would believe that they are Christians. So now currently, the Muslims call Christians when they are themselves as blue bones to refer to Christians. But one of my interviewees, one of the research participants, said that reciting the Bible verses saying that blessed are those who are persecuted in God's name. So even though Christians no longer carry heavy cross in contemporary Egypt, narratives about their history of persecution and martyrdom consistently spread through the word of mouth, and they identify themselves with the saint. And another aspect that constitute the Coptic pride would be how they are cultivating their moral self. So they differentiate themselves from Muslims and show how they are morally superior to them. And I do have some examples, but I don't think I have enough time to explain it. But if there is time, then I am happy to talk about one of the episodes that I heard through during my in-depth interviews. And this is a very interesting story that shows us how contemporary Coptic Christians are using one of the ancient Coptic Christians' stories to claim that they are moral, and they are trying to keep the moral behavior based on the religious teaching. So my argument in this paper is the Coptic pride has been formulated historically through identity revival movement and spiritual experience, such as miracle, that distinguishes Christians from the Muslim majority. However, after the Arab uprisings in Egypt, their discourse has shifted to more on persecution and heightened religiosity and morality. So what this paper contributes, this is the last slide. would be religious minorities have been relatively neglected in the study of Arab uprisings. What constructs religious identity changes over time, and the Coptic Christian case shows us that their identity is in the making through their new coping mechanism developed by the existential threat that has brought about after the Arab uprisings. Thank you. I'm happy to talk more about the examples that I was not able to share with you during the presentation.
Great, fantastic. We can come back to questions towards the end. Okay, we're moving to our next paper, Andrew McIntosh, Liquid Nationality and Fixed Precarity. So I'll hand over the floor to Andrew, and again, we have 15 minutes, so I'll send you a message 2 or 3 minutes before the end. Okay, Andrew.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. This is essentially a research project that I have done in collaboration with the chairman of Salam DHR, Jawad Farouz, and it is essentially a semi-academic piece where we have combined essentially our human rights data with several pieces of academic theory regarding nationalism and belonging of what we've come to define as liquid nationality and fixed precarity. In the aftermath of Bahrain's Arab Spring, known as the Pearl Uprising, as major crackdowns were instigated against Bahraini citizens. Apart from prolific institutionalized violence from police who suppressed protests, 990 Bahrainis, most of them being Shia activists, had their citizenships revoked, since 7 November 2012. Most of them were charged with terrorism or terrorism-related offenses, whose definition is broad and ambiguous under Bahraini law. Some of these individuals were detained and summarily deported to nations where they had alternative citizenships. Those without alternative citizenships were rendered stateless by revocation. As stateless individuals, they have no right to work or a pension. They cannot hold a bank account. They have no right to housing allowances, and they no longer possess official identification in the country. In several instances, any money or properties that were held by these people were expropriated by the Bahraini state. Such individuals were forced to either seek asylum in other nations as stateless persons, or they were labeled illegal immigrants in their own country, in which they were usually arrested, tortured into false confessions of being illegal immigrants, and subsequently deported to Lebanon, Iraq, or Iran, countries they did not necessarily have any ties to. In such instances, these people were, according to Giorgio Agamben, brought into the state of exception and reduced to bare life. That is, having no rights or protection, yet subject to the authority of the system all the same, rather than truly being banned by the nation state, were exiled, as an example in the rule, a form of rule's exception. Put more plainly, the state sought to make examples out of them as a symbol of its absolute sovereignty, even in the face of national and international law, which prohibits such practices. In April 2019, under international pressure, the government of Bahrain restored citizenship to 551 people. However, they are no longer entitled to the same rights normally guaranteed to Bahraini citizens. Apart from being monitored, as they have received no compensation for pensions lost, assets confiscated, or economic hardship they have endured. Moreover, they are reminded via formal and informal channels alike that they can only live freely in Bahrain under limited circumstances, that this freedom can be taken from them at any time, should they upset the government. Their bare life and state of exception continues. As a total of 343 Bahrainis have not had their citizenship restored since 2012, and they have received no indication that it will ever occur. They are currently either living in exile or they are incarcerated in Bahrain as political prisoners. Concurrently, the state has continued a systematic program of naturalization aimed at Sunni migrants in the Bahraini security forces, who are primarily utilized to police the country's Shia population. Citizenship is conferred to them as a gift by the king. In many cases, this is bestowed because higher ranks in the military hierarchy can only be held by Bahraini citizens. There is no sense of permanence to this gift, however, as striking members of the security forces were stripped of their acquired citizenship in 2013 and deported to Pakistan. Although these developments are part of an ongoing trend in Bahrain, they also reflect a post-2011 paradigm in which the concept of citizenship has grown increasingly fluid and contradictory. Citizenship in GCC countries such as Bahrain is sometimes described as a pyramid, where rights and privileges are intrinsically ordered by ethnic, tribal, and sectarian affiliations. However, I argue that this classification is incomplete in Bahrain. Rather than a fixed hierarchy that determines the rights and identities of citizens, Bahrain is currently moving towards a liquid form of national identity, where citizenship is arbitrarily granted, revoked, and restored on the whim of the king, making the basis of citizenship permanently precarious. Any citizen in Bahrain can be reduced to bare life in the state of exception, placing them in fixed precarity. This crystallizes the sovereignty of the state in action. Bahrain has successfully centralized the state's power in the executive branch, led by a member of the royal family. Neither parliament, the Shura Council, nor civil society are truly independent from the royal Khalifa family. Most of their members are government loyalists, as were family members. And speaking against the executive branch or royal family, whose members take up most positions of government, comes at a tremendous professional and personal risk. This gives the state the ability to grant, revoke, and return citizenship at its discretion, even though it contradicts the Bahraini constitution. The royal Khalifa family is the state, and there is no legitimate means to challenge it. Instead of living within an imagined community, rights and national identity are a sovereign commodity in both an autocratic and neoliberal context. A commodified citizenship that can always be changed by the sovereign and provides neither protection nor identity to its citizens. Benedict Anderson theorized that the identity modern nationalism creates, the imagined community, succeeded the concept of the sacred community, which emphasized the primacy of monarchy and religion as a communal glue. Unlike Anderson's analysis of European nation-states, however, Bahrain's ruling elites never adopted the arguably Eurocentric idea of the imagined community from below, determined by vernacular identities. Instead, practices such as the revocation of citizenship demonstrate that Bahrain centralizes the power of the state and the sovereign, allowing it to determine the value of citizenship and belonging with an imagined community from above, one that is designed and cultivated by Bahrain's elites. That cultivation is currently belied via the construction of state narratives, where Bahrain is depicted as a transnational, cosmopolitan business hub. These narratives promote an alternative social contract, where fundamental rights and shared identity are waived in exchange for financial growth. This social contract enables state media to construct narratives for international audiences that a society is pluralistic, diverse, and centered on economic development, which in turn promotes common prosperity. In practice, Bahraini residents and citizens alike are largely kept segregated from one another based on their ethnicity and religious affiliation. As the society is, by design, incohesive, where the state has historically utilized a divide and rule strategy. Instead of an imagined community, Bahrain consists of siloed communities and precarity. The vast majority of the people there are aware that their residency or citizenship can be revoked, reducing them to bare life. In this case, bare life is not the state of exception, but the rule in Bahraini society. But the fundamental activity of concentrated sovereign power is the production of bare life. Not only is this paradigm an affront to human rights and international law, but it also prohibits forms of inclusive nationalism and national identity, making its communities divided, afraid, and ultimately easier to control. And in many cases, the international community has been complicit in this thus far, as it were members of the expatriate class, as it ultimately partake in it, as it by living in Bahrain, by participating in its labor markets, and ultimately as being complicit in its academic and economic way of life. As everyone else in Bahrain, regardless of their class, really outside of the Al Khalifa, runs the risk of being reduced to bare life as well. However, for members of its more marginalized classes, such as rural Shia and other religious minorities, those risks come at far greater consequences. Thank you.
Great, Andrew. You left us lots of time out there, so hopefully we can come back towards the end and ask you lots of questions to allow you to interrogate your thesis a bit more. All right, great. So we'll move on to our next speaker, Mustafa Amanshawi, and his talk is entitled Citizenship as Sectarianization in the Middle East. And again, 15 minutes, and I'll give you a notification about 2 or 3 minutes before the end of that. So I'll hand over the floor to you, Mustafa.
Thanks so much, John, for the introduction and chairing the session. I do really appreciate, and I keep looking at attending conferences as a great way of refining my preliminary arguments and engaging with colleagues and scholars in order to reach a better quality, if you like, of what I'm presenting at this very opaque and rough stage of organizing my thoughts. So please feel free to just to take it as a kind of the first stage of my research as such, which is based on the hypothetical argument that citizenship and sectarianism are two faces of the same coin. A few months ago, I was watching on YouTube a seminar in a research council in the Arab region, in which most panelists would argue that one of the key solutions to the sectarian identity politics in the Arab region, grouping it as it is after the Arab Spring, is citizenship laws and augmenting the sense of being a citizen. So my argument is completely flipping around this argument and proving the opposite one, that the two citizenship is not antithetical to sectarianism, but on the other side, it can help its durability and entrenchment in the Arab societies as such. And the way to prove my argument is based on a specific definition of sectarianism. This definition is mainly not based on religion as the bone of contention. I know that some scholars would adopt the primordialist arguments that religion is fully steeped and institutionalized in any relationship as sectarianism could be. I believe this definition is problematic because a number of reasons. It ignores the variations, the changes, the contingencies in the sectarian making process. Just if you think of the Saudi-Iranian relationship as example or exemplary case study of the sectarianization, we have to put in mind the Saudis and Iranians are not always inimical or very enemies on that relationship. There's a sense of friendship across history in which they can come together, collaborate, and share niceties and courtesies of calling each other brothers and friends, and all these elements coming together, which challenge and contest this primordialist definition based on the full separation and the treating the two sides as opposite poles, if you like. Furthermore, there is a sense of dynamic plurality of sectarianism as well. Just recently published a paper with Simon Mabin looking at the intra-Sunnism, how the relationship between Qatar and Saudi Arabia is based on the intra-Sunni, intra-Wahhabi. So there are different versions, if you like, of religion and religious identities here, which makes this kind of the primordialism in defining sectarianism problematic. So I move away from religion, the first step. And the second one is actually moving away from definition as well. As Fanar Haddad said, it's very notoriously difficult to define sectarianism. It's imbued with considerable ambiguity, and it's essentially contested. So my argument is that sectarianism is a process of meanings which manifested through themes, and under which the attention should be actually where does sectarianization occur and how. In that specific way of looking at sectarianism, the point of departure is not necessarily ideologies or like religion, Sunnism, or Islam. The point of departure is political agency. To be more specific, within a specific context, pursuing political goals, how specific actors would seek to meet their goals and serve their interests. And in this sense, as Nader Hashemi and Danny Postel would argue, it's authoritarianism, not religion, that is the critical the critical factor that shapes the sectarianization process, unquote. So the end of quote. So part of the process that we're speaking about is how to mobilize people through shaping a dominant form of group identity, and how that identification with the group feeds into a sense of othering and boundary making with the outside world. And this is where scholars like Simon Mabin, Lucia Duvini would argue succinctly and astutely that sectarianization is a process of identity making, or simply becoming different. In this sense, that we can actually group different layers, if you like, of the sectarian making process, like nationalism or even secularism as well. So the political system of Assad would fit in because it presents a sort of secular sectarianism in a way. So if I go back to my question or hypothetical statement that sectarianism and citizenship are two faces of the same coin, I would argue that it's because the two concepts are based on a dichotomous relationship of inclusion and exclusion. If we trace, for example, the evolution of citizenship and migration laws in the United States, and I'm mentioning the United States comes as it epitomizes the type of citizenship which is as normative as it is many countries to adopt or emulate as the most democratic all over the world. Even that type has always been based on inclusion and exclusion. So if you surf through the law evolution when it comes to migration in the United States and the citizenship granted or taken out, you would find that in the late 18th century, the citizenship is only granted to the whites, excluding the blacks. In 1875, excluding the Chinese, as manifested in the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Then the Japanese exclusion in the 20th century, or you can find quota system as well at a certain time of history. So the evolution of the citizenship law all the way to the amendments and civil rights guaranteed in the 20th century was a journey of inclusion and exclusion. So in that case, the citizenship would get closer to my definition or my understanding of sectarianism in the Arab region as a form of inclusion and exclusion, in which all the time you set boundaries between the Sunnis and Shia, or the boundaries between citizens and non-citizens, or the boundaries between a specific tribe and another tribe. So in that sense, another element is I think I would need, if I conceptualize a definition of sectarianism, to make it more specifically to the authoritarian context. Perhaps that is a task that should be done as well with the citizenship in the Arab region. And one of the key problematic element is we tend to apply the citizenship in the Republican and liberal versions of what it is to the Arab context, which is a bit different in a way. And I believe the differences or the need to reconsider citizenship as a form of boundary making is based on the different principles. For example, in the Western Republican model, that is one of the key two pivots that we refer to. It's mainly looking at citizenship as civic self-rule embodied in classical institutions and practices like a rotation of offices, which that underpins Aristotle's characterization of the citizen as one capable of ruling and being ruled in return. In that sense, citizens, they share the holding of office, and I'm quoting Aristotle in Politics. So this civic self-rule is the heart of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's project as well, developed it into seeing citizens as free, working under laws, which is legitimate as well. So the active participation in the process of deliberation and decision making, and you have this liberal model, and even the Republican model, which is mainly based in duties as well. They actually, that model as well is assuming that the citizen is a primary political agent, individual whose private activities leave little time in politics. So there are sort of political group which are work on that. So you find the sense of the two meanings are completely different in the Arab context. Perhaps that to do with the state positioned in the two modules, liberal and Republican, as a neutral entity in which actually acting as a sort of a guarantor between the rights and duties in which individual and the outside is part of, which is completely different case in the Arab region, where the state is conflated with the regime in one way or another. So I think that, and furthermore, the separation between the private and public is no longer there, with that sense of actually situating the individual within what symbolic interactionists would call it the I-me dichotomy, which the me is all the time the predominant position the individual is always acted upon, rather than an actor with a specific decision. And perhaps this is one of the key criticism coming from the feminists who argue that the definition of citizenship is based on this exclusion of the women's sphere, if you like, where it's a made property, and which the same argument can be made on the exclusion of different groups when it comes to the bidun in Kuwait, for example, which is actually the bidun that means within a citizenship, within a kind of a state position in this sense. So it's this sense of exclusionary approach can actually look in particular how the two concepts come together and perhaps highlight that sense of inequality rather than the neutrality when it comes to the position of the state as dominant as it is in the Arab region, or the position of individuals, who individual is all the time, as Ram, one of our the key scholars here at Lancaster, would argue the individual is individual. It's all the time associated in a combined relationship in which the person is losing its own individuation and become part of a community. Even within the Shia sect, you find the individual is being eclipsed in one way or another within this kind of the sectarian process at the meso level in one way or another. So these are my ideas, as rough, as scattered as it could be. So I do really appreciate your feedback, and thanks for listening to me on that. Thank you.
Great, fantastic. Great, we've got plenty of time left. So we'll move on to our final speaker, Tarek Siddiq, and his talk is titled Citizenship as a Resource for Political Participation and Interest. And again, we've got about 15 minutes, so I'll give you a wee hands up about 2 or 3 minutes before the end. So I'll give the floor to you.
Great, thank you very much. I hope the presentation is visible. Yeah, so just a very brief apology. I'm not the biggest fan of PowerPoint in virtual presentations, so my slides are going to be relatively brief. But I hope to give an outline of the argument that I want to make today, which is centered around reframing citizenship as a resource, or something that can be actively utilized in processes of political participation. And I'm drawing from the case study of Iran. Now, the main idea that I want to outline today is that we oftentimes think about processes of insider-outsider dynamics where there is a political center of power and a periphery of disenfranchised or people with lower accesses to these institutions of power. And we have means and mechanisms of this stratification. So this can include sometimes economic mechanisms, they can include physical proximity, they can include ideological proximity, the latter being particularly relevant for cases of authoritarian countries that I have in mind. And they can also include citizenship. And this is not an exclusive list of mechanisms of exclusion, but I would very much argue that citizenship is one of those forms that define who can be part of a political inside group and who's part of the political outside group. And in that sense, it's a legalistic means of defining a power relationship and defining, in essence, ideological stance within the system. So who gets to participate in citizenship as a framework, as a resource for participation is subject to these political deliberations, particularly at the time of state, of the foundation of states and the processes of state building, which occur differently depending on whether we're talking about a revolutionary state or a otherwise growing state. So this with the key theme that I want to discuss here. Now, for the case of Iran, we have a political system that is very, very much defined by distinguishing political insiders and political outsiders. These are generally distinguished in a political sense, in an ideological sense. So we have regime insiders who are part of the power architecture, and we have regime outsiders who tend to be either not involved in these institutions of power or even openly antagonistic to them by being members of the opposition, by being members of social groups. Now, at the same time, while we can discuss these in terms of the regime architecture, there are also categories which place you within that architecture, either on the inside or the outside, without much decision-making going on. These can include, for example, membership to minorities. Whether you're a member of a religious minority or a member of the religious majority defines whether you puts you closer to the political center or further outside of the political center. And the same goes for membership to ethnic minorities, but also for citizenship. Now, having a look at the actual numbers of who lives in Iran, I would argue that this is actually a very large number of people that are affected by these exclusions through citizenship. So this is not a minor phenomenon. This is something that happens on a very large scale. And because of that, it needs more addressing and more concern. So generally, we can assume that Iran has a population of about 84 million. But at the same time, it has a huge number of undocumented refugees, particularly from neighboring countries which had been embroiled in war for the last 2 decades. This is Iraq and Afghanistan, to name the more prominent examples, but there's also a sizable number of, for example, Syrian refugees. So generally a refugee hosting country. And these are kind of hard to estimate, because the numbers vary by source. The official numbers are much, much lower than the numbers by the UNHCR. Overall, I would say it's about 4% of the population which doesn't have Iranian citizenship, but still lives long-term in Iran. So in some of these cases, we have refugee populations which have lived there since the 1980s, so 4 decades now, and essentially have been living in Iran as long as there is a citizenship of the Islamic Republic, because they entered the country very few years after the revolution in 79. So what is really the distinction between these populations and those that get to exercise the right of vote? We also have other populations, which to name another one, which I can give you numbers for, and then we'll get to the ones that I'm not able to give you numbers for, Iranians with dual citizenship, many of whom live abroad, but many of whom also do not live abroad. And there is a claim to be involved in politics as well. Not everyone who goes abroad wishes to resettle in a country abroad. They want to oftentimes seek refuge for a limited period of time, but still make claims politically to the country of origin. And this applies to large numbers of the Iranian diaspora, but also to future generations, which then also oftentimes have dual citizenship, because Iran doesn't let you go out of their citizenship. So these dual citizenship Iranians, again, make up about 4% of the total population that we're talking about here. So the number of people that do not fall into the framework of having one single unified Iranian citizenship already makes up about 8% of the population. There's also a legal provision which allows minorities domestically to have dual citizenship. This is an exemption in the citizenship law, because in Iranian law, actually dual citizenship is not legal, but there is an exception to it, which is for members of minorities. So which used to engage more in cross-border trade and cross-border migration, which has been reduced heavily over the last 50 years, but these provisions still exist. So there are no concrete numbers for these. And there's also a number of populations which have limited documentation and limited means of showing proof of their citizenship, which they legally would have, but which they don't always have the necessary documents to utilize. And this applies particularly to Iranians living in the peripheries, in remote locations, and pursuing nomadic lifestyles. So there is another sizable portion of the population, which I can't give you numbers for, but which exists according to multiple sources, which also doesn't have access to this type of citizenship. To give you again the numbers, the UNHCR estimates these populations, again, only the number of undocumented Afghans being about 2.2 million. I would expect that number to go up a lot now this year because of the recent influx of refugees. So generally, this is a long-term phenomenon in Iranian politics, that you have a sizable number of undocumented refugees living there in the second and third generation at some points now. Now, before I continue, maybe also some brief words on how I conceptualize citizenship here. And it's like, I would say that citizenship is can be understood in two basic ways. It's a political and legal demarcation. So the legal demarcation, I think, is a very obvious one, which is you either have it or you don't have it. And if you have citizenship, that means you're a citizen. If you don't, it usually, at least under international law, is supposed to mean that you're a citizen of another state. We know from many research sources that that's not necessarily the case. Cases of dual citizens, non-citizens, unnaturalized citizens, and so on and so forth really complicate that matter even under international law. But even when looking within a country, citizenship also entails a political demarcation of privilege between groups and among groups. So within the power architecture, there are some which are assigned citizenship in order to be allowed to participate, in order to have specific political rights, which also exists in authoritarian countries. And this becomes heavily contentious, where citizenship can actually be actively revoked. And this happens across regimes quite often, not necessarily on a mass scale, but often enough that it's a significant phenomenon. A very recent example outside of Iran would have been actually the citizenship law in India 2 years ago, where the Muslim populations in certain areas were revoked of the citizenship, not through an active act of revocation, but by enforcing rules of documentation. And with many populations not having any documentation, and it effectively ended in a revocation of citizenship. And also citizenship can be outright denied. And this is something that was a huge debate in Iranian politics over the last 2 years, actually, where refugees, of course, oftentimes are denied accesses to citizenship, but specifically binational children had 2 different paths to citizenship. So if you're a binational in Iran, I'm talking not about the diaspora here, and your mother is Iranian, but your father is a refugee, that usually meant that you would not get any citizenship. Whereas if your father was Iranian and your mother was a refugee, you would get citizenship because citizenship was passed through the father. And there was a lot of legal and parliamentary debates of changing that, which happened earlier this year. But the implementation, I'm still a little bit worried about that, to what extent that will actually materialize. But here there's already a political debate of who to extend that access to and who to deny it to. And this is a politically loaded question as well, because it brings up questions of who would benefit within the power architecture of bringing certain groups into the state and denying it to other certain groups. And now this citizenship does not only come with certain rights, but it also comes with a certain degree of legitimacy. So beyond formalized forms of participation like elections, many types of participation can be delegitimized by saying, well, you don't have a claim to make in that state or to that state. And in that sense, citizenship also entails a degree of creating a virtual legal persona. So even if you do not necessarily care about the citizenship, or it's not something that affects your identity of belonging to a state or not, it can be a tool to create a persona which then allows you access to certain institutions, which sometimes entails name changes, which sometimes entails modifying key facts about yourself, whether this is your physical description that is part of your passport, whether this is defining a gender in a when you don't identify with a dichotomous gender constructions, and so on and so forth. It actually creates a virtual persona which is not necessarily tied to your personal understanding of self. Now, this constitutes a problem because we very often think of citizenship as a natural property of living in a polity. But actually, in many cases, as I've argued, a large number of people are excluded from it. By reframing this in terms of thinking of citizenship as a resource, we can discuss more the inequalities of access that come to it and the mechanisms of power which enable these inequalities of access. So it's essentially participation here occurs through multiple layers of access, like physical proximity and capital, as in the first slide. And citizenship is a critical one to reassess who can actually utilize them and who cannot. And at the same time, citizenship itself becomes a strategic move, whether you acquire citizenship or whether you fake citizenship or whether you formalize a theoretically existing citizenship, or which citizenship you utilize in terms of having multiple citizenships becomes critical in your strategy vis-a-vis the state. This furthermore opens up alliances of non-citizens, and these non-citizens can first of all start off with a shared sense of disenfranchisement with other members of the state who may be marginalized in other means. So they lack maybe the access to structures of power. They maybe lack the access of certain resources and certain legitimization. And this in turn produces a similarity in strategies within that periphery. So both disenfranchised citizens and non-citizens will utilize informal means of participation. They will utilize semi-legal means. They will be spontaneous and self-organized. And they can also at times, and this happened throughout my fieldwork quite frequently, showcase shared identities of marginalization with heavy limitations, because citizenship remains a major discourse for who gets access and who doesn't. But it does entail this shared identity of marginalization, which at specific junctures can become a starting point for larger cross alliances. And my final point, and then I will drop off this presentation, is that while these shared similarities in interests and articulation of interests exist, they also manifest through asymmetries of repression. So while citizens, disenfranchised citizens and non-citizens can co-identify and share grievances, the state that reacts to those grievances continues a divergent treatment of them. So for example, refugees would be treated much harsher and with very little oversight by the Iranian state. Ethnic minorities would very often face questions of legitimacy, whether their citizenship is actually valid, whether they're actually members of the state, and thus at least politically curbing their rights. And while at the same time, to contrast that, repression in the state capital would, even when it's very repressive, entail some basic rights which are not afforded to non-citizens and citizens in the periphery. For example, specific legal protections, for example, media attention and attention by political elites from the opposition, for example. And last, dual citizenship itself complicates this field by a lot, because it's subject to an entirely different repression dimension. For example, there's now the diplomatic arena where states actually discuss which citizens are subject to their protection and which citizens are not. And this can be a highly contentious matter because citizenship can simply not be accepted. And at the same time, it opens up a degree of international mobility. So having dual citizenship can be a problem if the Iranian state treats you as a foreign citizen and doesn't afford you certain rights. It can also be a benefit if you then get a certain degree of diplomatic protection. And it can also be an important resource if you can avoid repression by temporarily resetting in a different country because you have this dual citizenship, which is an option that single citizenship holders simply do not have. And with that, thank you very much. And I'll give it over to the discussion.
Great. What a fantastic set of papers and a really great way to kick off the CPAD conference. So a really great set of papers exploring both processes of inclusion and exclusion within state building and citizenship, and also the ways in which kind of groups who are excluded from citizenship can contest their status. So we have lots of time, about 20 minutes for questions. So I'm going to open up the floor to our attendees to make themselves either kind of visible or to put their hands up for questions. And while we're waiting for people to do this, I can actually see we have a question which has come through the live feed. So I'm going to begin with that question from Sarah Tonzi. And it says, thank you for the interesting presentations and contributions. I have a question for Mustafa. I was wondering if you could provide an example, please. As you mentioned, there is always this idea of brotherhood on one hand, the work of Fabos on the Sudanese in Egypt, for instance, and the idea of an imagined community highlighted by Andrew McIntosh in his presentation. So Sarah says, thank you and nods for contributions. So Mustafa, I'll kind of direct that question to you first, and then maybe we can open up, that question as well to the rest of the participants.
Thanks so much, John. Thanks, Sarah, for the question. I think this is what's it's missing in my presentation. I didn't give one example, and thanks for the nice reminder of that. I think that what I have in mind for my argument that sectarianism and citizenship are faces of the same coin is I keep thinking of examples. Just take Kuwait, for example. It's in one case of the most progressive and liberal in the Arab region, specifically the Gulf region. If we judge it by the laws of equality as such, citizenship is one way where the rulers of the country are consolidating their power. In 2014, a number of key figures like Nabil Al-Awadi, the spokesperson for Al-Barraq, Muslim Al-Barraq, these opposition forces, they were stripped of their citizenship. The key argument was that they are destabilizing or causing disturbances and dissent as well. So ironically enough, the reasons or rationale for taking out citizenship from these individuals is completely the same reasons for the citizenship laws enacted elsewhere, which is that those people literally are practicing their rights to speak, to express their points of views. So the end outcome of this kind of expression of views is that citizenship is being taken. And I can remember in Kuwait as well, if you think of the 1980s, after a number of bombings, including the assassination attempts on the Kuwaiti Emir, the reaction of the state was stripping citizenship or nationality from a number of groups of people who mostly Shias. They have their own accusation of collaboration with an outside, which my colleagues referred to, which is more specifically Iran. So this is actually a repeated case. If you think of Qatar after the coup that happened in the 90s, the reaction of the new Emir is stripping citizenship from a specific tribe, which was thought to support the return of the former Emir as well. So in all these cases, the political agency is restricted to people, the ruling elite, where individuals are being and my cases from Qatar and Kuwait, they are actually it comes within this kind of clientelist politics where the citizenship means benefits. So citizenship is not only about duties, it's not only about rights, it's about benefits as well. And these benefits are clientelist in a rentier state kind of system where the relationship, the money is not coming from any kind of duties like paying taxes, it's coming from the ground, where it makes it more problematic in the Gulf region as such. So these two examples that are coming in my mind on this, and perhaps I mean just the Copts is being mentioned. I wouldn't speak too much about that, but as an Egyptian myself, all what comes to my mind, the ID right now, where the first line is mentioning your name, the second one is are you a Muslim or a Christian or Muslim, or what is your religious identity as well? So the citizenship is coming based on this inclusion and exclusion along the religious element, and as another, and this is really problematic because in that way the citizenship is being defined about which religious identity group you are part of, and that takes us again to the inclusion and exclusion element, or the sectarianization element when it comes to citizenship as such.
Great, thanks. We've actually got some more kind of questions coming through. So a question actually from Abbas for Hyun, and it's actually a question I was kind of thinking of as well. So I'm really glad Abbas has asked this one. And his question for you, Hyun, is, does Coptic pride have political implications, and why has it emerged after the eruption of a protest in Egypt in 2011? And it was something I was kind of thinking about in terms of your work. What are Coptics trying to achieve through this form of renewal? Is it about internal community building, or has this been used as a mechanism for pursuing outward political goals?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. My reading is more about the community building or identity revival, rather than being political, and rather than this Coptic pride leading to some kind of political mobilizations within society, or bringing about like policy changes, for example. So it's more about their coping mechanisms that they have developed internally within their communities particularly after the Arab uprisings. And so sort of related to the second question would be, so if we look at the political circumstances and change made after 2011, we see that heightened sectarian tensions between Christians and Muslims, and it has been in the peak after Mohammad Morsi was removed by the military in 2013, right? Yeah, in July 2013. So we have seen increasing damages and explosions within the church buildings, and that has brought up a lot of existential threats to Christians as religious minorities. So as a response to this threat, I believe that Coptic Christians started to talk more about their persecution in history, and talk about in multiple cases of my interviews, in-depth interviews with Christians, they talk a lot about they are not afraid of being in the church and the church being bombed during the Mass, for example. And many of them said that they are ready. So so I think even though they feel threatened and worried, concerned about the situations that made after the Arab uprisings, but they are they are bringing up this kind of like stronger pride based on who they are. So I hope that answers to your question.
Yeah, great. Actually thought the example of a Marian apparition was really interesting because it reminded me of Croat nationalism in Bosnia and how it constructed the Marian apparition in Medjugorje in the 1970s and 1980s as a way to kind of foster nationalist revival. There's a really good article actually in Nations and Nationalism, I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago. It might be worth having a look at because it's very kind of similar dynamics of Marian apparitions being used as a basis for nationalist mobilization. Okay, great. Some more questions coming through. So a question from Fatima for Andrew. Does tribal identity have direct consequences in regard to the exclusionary process in the Gulf states?
Yes, absolutely it does. An excellent example of that would essentially be monopolization of power by essentially royal families, which are generally based on tribe, such as the Al Khalifa family in Bahrain. Although this is definitely true for other Gulf states as well. You can see this through also Saud, the Al Thani family in Qatar. I mean, all of these are very powerful families that simply the name of it denotes your power. And they're very large families as well because of this, because they are based on tribal affiliations. One of the main demarcations of the value of your citizenship or non-citizenship in a country like Bahrain is your last name. Which indicates essentially your place in society. And it also, in many cases, indicates your sect as well. And it's, to a certain degree, it creates some privilege with Western expats who live there as well, because they don't quite fall into that system. They're somewhat removed from it. And that shields them to a certain degree from the sectarian interpretations of citizenship and non-citizenship that exist in the country.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a few more minutes for further questions. If any of our attendees would like to come forward to ask a question, please make yourself visible. Let's give it a minute.
Sorry, John, I can see a question in the chat box. Is that from Mirai? I'm not quite sure if it's the same one that was answered or a different one.
I can't see this unless it's come through to you directly.
Oh, yeah. No, I think I can.
So yeah, maybe if you can see it, would you like to read out the question?
Yeah, so I think the question is for me. Thank you, Mirai, for the question. So yeah, so let me read the question. I appreciate the focus on morality. I was wondering about what you make of events or discourses that really challenge the exceptionalism of Copts. For example, the murder of Anba Epiphanius by another monk, or how some Copts actually reject the martyrdom narrative by saying that they don't want to be martyred. We want to leave. Lastly, how much of this about the revolutionary moment of Arab uprisings versus the era of martyrdom of the last decade? Yeah, so thank you so much for the question. So I think this gives me a lot of so interesting points that I can think of. And of course, in this paper, it doesn't really discuss the differences of understanding within Coptic Christian communities about their identities. But in my larger project, which is the book manuscript, I discuss how, so for example, social class and gender and geography of their residential area would affect those Coptic Christians and their identity formation. And so for example, I would see, this is also related to the historian Paul Sedrat's work, where he wrote about the class differences and identity formation. So it's very similar to what he found in based on, so what I found is the Christians from upper class or like upper middle class backgrounds, they would say much less about the martyrdom, or rather they have created more harmonious relations with the Muslims from the similar socioeconomic backgrounds. While I see clear differences among lower class Christians or working class Christians, that they discuss much more about persecution and martyrdom. So there should be different differences by social class that we can think of. And I think I don't have the clear answer right now for the second set of question, but thanks for giving me the opportunity to think about this point.
Okay, great. Yeah, my computer's a wee bit slow and it's now catching up with the chat. See, we have a hand up, Saidali Fatami, if you'd like to ask a question. So see a hand up from Saidali Fatami. Would you like to ask a question? Okay, yeah, no response there. Anybody else would like to ask a question? Got a couple of minutes left. Okay, see, Simon Maybon. So Simon, feel free.
Thanks. I put my my question in the Q&A, but something strange seems to be happening. Thanks, everyone. I really enjoyed those papers. It's really provocative. I wonder if there are perhaps more appropriate ways of talking about belonging other than citizenship, and I guess belonging to what and when and why and how and all of those types of things. As Tarek notes, citizenship is politically charged, which comes with all manner of issues. So is a different way possible? Is it desirable? Is it something that should be explored further, or do we stick with citizenship and everything that comes with that? And that's to everyone, really, although I think hopefully Tarek's got something to say on that as well. So thanks.
Okay, Tarek, would you like to go first?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the key questions that I'm actually occupied with myself. And I would like say if there's basically three basic sets of answers. I'm going to get to the one that I prefer the most myself. But sort of like coming from a lot of migration studies, I think one of the most obvious ones would be that sense of belonging is very intimately tied to place of residence. So we would actually look at residency as another way to analyze senses of belonging. I find that problematic because, in particular, when you have deliberate displacements that can exclude, again, a lot of people. So I don't think it necessarily replaces citizenship, but maybe complements it to some extent. And the other way to approach this, and this is what I pursue very much in most of my work, is by understanding it through claim making. So if I make claims towards a polity, there is at least an understanding of belonging. Sometimes it's just a one-sided understanding, but very, very often it's actually a mutual understanding. So states will react to diaspora demands, even though they don't necessarily understand diaspora as belonging to this polity by legal definition. But there's a political understanding that these are to some extent legitimate claim makers. And I think these processes can sort of conceptualize procedural understandings of belonging. And then sort of the third way, and I think this is what a lot of the critical literature would do, is essentially complement and modify understandings of citizenship. So still treat citizenship as sort of the main vantage point of understanding belonging, but admitting that it's a flawed concept inherently and complementing it at places where it's appropriate. For example, by bringing in residency, by bringing in cross-national understandings, and bringing in processes of claim making.
Great. Andrew, I saw your hand up. Did you want to address this question?
Yeah, certainly. Forgive me for waffling a bit here, but obviously citizenship as a concept is a real can of worms politically, particularly now where we see a tremendous amount of transnationalism. With migrant populations, whether we have that of the idea of the sort of transnational proletariat, of refugees, and what we think of as sort of the new sort of strategic globalism of expatriate classes, another politically charged word. That being said, I mean, you could look at places like UAE, like Qatar, like Bahrain, where you have this idea of, very large populations of people living without citizenship that are offset by economic benefits or by living in sort of permanent precarity as migrant workers, as sort of the sign of a neoliberal future. Where the idea of citizenship and protection is essentially forwent in exchange for either, financial opportunities or this sense of, new communities that are built across global networks. That being said, I think there's also major pushback to that, that we've seen particularly in many countries, particularly in the West. Theresa May had sort of famously or infamously, said that, a citizen of the world is a citizen of nowhere. And this idea of particularly populist nationalism, doubling down on this idea of what makes citizenship, and sort of citizenship as almost a sacred document of this idea of very much concentrating power again within state documentation and demarcation. And there's some bleed over with that as well, because one thing we have seen in more Western countries is that they are coming up with new ways to codify laws on stripping citizenship from people as well. So despite the rhetoric that we're seeing, this idea of new precarity in citizenship is, happening in other places besides the Middle East as well. And that in itself can be very threatening to the idea of citizenship. Do we have multiple ideas of what it means to identify with other people? Absolutely, we do. We have built, as we said, these major global communities that are built on identity, that are built on shared values, shared politics, racial politics that has long existed, especially if you look at, countries like China, for instance, which makes a tremendous amount of effort to, influencing ethnic Chinese populations abroad. That being said, it's one that doesn't have necessarily the concentrated state power that we think of at this time that can ultimately plug into polities. Will it in the future? It very well might. But at the moment, we're still in this sort of liminal state where we still have to look into the demarcation because if anything, states are growing more powerful because of flows of people, flows of information, and the need to categorize everything.
Okay, great, thanks, Andrew. Mustafa and Hyun, would you like to add any further and quick thoughts? We've got about 2 or 3 minutes before we end.
I can take 1 minute and thanks Simon for the question. I think it's a very pivotal to mention the sense of belonging. For me, linking the sectarianism and citizenship in 3 key ways. I think one of the main problems in the Arab region when it comes to citizenship related to sense of belonging is that citizenship is very symbolic rather than objective. So you become a citizen not necessarily because how long you stay in the country, what kind of criteria as objective, like language acquisition as such, but simply because of a symbolic position that is actually coming along with that. So the second point with that sense of belonging is the subjective nature of citizenship. So a lot of people, especially in the Gulf, they gain their citizenship because of a subjective relationship with a ruling elite, not an objective criteria as just mentioned. And perhaps that sense of belonging relates to my third point, which is that the citizenship is mainly discursive. So just it's in a society which is full of conspiratorial rhetoric, it depends on a lot of people, communities are denied citizenship amidst that sense of communal fear. Palestinians in Egypt are denied citizenship because they fear that Israelis can infiltrate within this kind of intermarriage relationship between the Israelis and Palestinians. The same case, it comes to a United Arab Emirates woman married to a foreigner denied that citizenship to the children at a certain time, because that sense of fear of the outside coming in. So I totally believe that sense of belonging is really important because it's subjective and symbolic, and at the same time it lies in the meanings itself, which is very conflicting and contested process, not very neutral as citizenship should be. Yeah, thanks so much for that question.
Okay, thank you, Mustafa.
Okay. And just add very briefly, my work doesn't, it's not framed by the citizens per se. It focuses more on daily sectarianism and how sectarianism is formed based on daily interactions between Christians and Muslims. But I think what is really interesting about the Coptic Christians case here is they have they have the nationalism, the sense of belonging that is attached to the land. So which some of the scholars call territorial nationalism. So I think that has been, that is an interesting formation of the sense of belonging created by Coptic Christians.
Great. We've actually got a bit more time. For some reason, I thought the panel was finishing at 10:30. I've just had a look and it's saying 10:45. So we've actually got a bit more time for questions, which is great news because I can see somebody's hand up, Javier Bordon. If Javier is available, could you please make yourself visible to ask a question? Javier, can you hear me? No, sounds like I'm talking to the ether. No, okay. Anybody else would like to add any?
Oh, sorry, I'd like to add something. Sorry, my computer wasn't working before.
Okay, great.
Yeah, sorry. I'd like to ask, I guess I'd like to ask, well, first of all, thank you everyone for your presentations. Maybe my question would be addressing Mustafa, but actually can be answered by anyone who's willing to. And yeah, I like if you could tell us a bit about the conditions or the circumstances, contingencies that might happen when, for instance, migrant workers or communities that may find themselves in precarious situations develop a sense of, or associate certain communities. Let's say, I'll give an example. Let's say, for example, in Bahrain, South Asian migrant communities who might develop a sense of danger or threat towards Shia Bahraini citizens, and how what are the conditions, the circumstances that make this happen? How one non-citizen community develops or associates danger to factions or communities or groups within a citizen scribe community. Thank you.
Okay. Mustafa, did you want to go first on this?
Thanks, John. Thanks, Javier, for the question. It's very, very interesting because my point of departure is how authoritarian leaders make use, abuse, if you like, of the citizenship or lack thereof. So perhaps if you mentioned Bahrain, which is a great striking example after the Arab Spring, where the key rhetoric as the official narrative coming from the Bahraini officials is that the revolution, the protests, the questions, I'm sure that Andrew can speak much better on that than me. The key rhetoric is that the revolution is a conspiracy from neighboring Iran, where the protesters mostly at the beginning were not identified by their religious identity or sectarian identity, and then turn it into that kind of Shia predominant. The sense of belonging is that contested on the basis of the Iranian connection, and when the Shia belonging as well. So this is a national crisis in which the state reacted by evoking the same dividing narrative, in which citizenship is contested with that old sense of allegiance as well. So this is one way of answering the question. The second one is you mentioned the migrants or expats, depending what you call them. And I think this is one of the dilemmas, contradictions in the Gulf region, because as everyone is speaking about including them, the golden citizenship, whatever form of citizenship offered to those individuals for economic reasons. But one of the key concerns, or perhaps the counter narratives, even among the Gulf people themselves, is the threats coming along if they are of a specific sect or a specific background. So that takes us back again to the sense of fear. If you listen to radio in Gulf countries, you can actually see people calling and say, I am a citizen, so I'm a bit concerned about queues in hospitals or certain habits happening or certain practices which are not proud of. So I think when it comes to social cohesion, there are a bit of concerns coming along, not necessarily from the ruling part, but from the social part. And perhaps that relates to the main problems in the state formation on the Arab region. It's external, it's not very dynamically coherent with the build-up of the sociopolitics of society. There's something wrong with the state formation, and sadly, it keeps tracking down until now and causes all these kind of contradictions in one way or another.
Good. Andrew, did you want to add any thoughts on this?
Yes, certainly. I mean, one of the main issues in a country like Bahrain is that the communities in it are extraordinarily divided. For instance, Dr. Siddiq had mentioned more or less this idea of, cross-marginalization sympathy and, asymmetrical as forms of oppression. One of the major issues in Bahrain is that there is very little sympathy between these groups. They have little to no interaction with each other, and they tend to have also a great deal of animus towards one another, particularly like South Asian migrant populations, particularly, and the local Shia population, particularly because they are in direct competition with one another for labor, where the Shia population feels like they have been denied jobs and live in precarity because of the migrant population. And the migrant population has been subject, one, to economic precarity themselves, where they have little to no protection for rights. And they see that Bahrainis have that. And, that's a source of acrimony, as well as that there are numerous incidences of xenophobia, harassment between these groups as well. And there's very much the idea that migrants are loyal to the government and that they seek to replace the Shia population. And this leads to conspiracy mongering as well, which can be a real problem between all of the populations, particularly because they know almost nothing about each other. Many of them live in communities that are, quite literally gated from one another. And that is by design. This is quadrillage. That is, part of the state's understanding of how to manage these populations. And that is a very serious issue. And it's one of the things that, NGOs like Salam DHR is working on to essentially create more dialogue between these groups of people, because that is something that many of these states don't want. And that's something that we've seen to a particular amount heavily introduced in the Gulf, with the way that even just neighborhoods and communities have been designed, where they are siloed, where conspiracies and, animus and recriminations are very much allowed to fester, because it's easier for the state to exist and to maintain these hierarchies of citizenship if there isn't essentially cross-sympathy between these marginalized groups.
Thanks, Andrew. And Tak or Hyun, would you like to jump in? Add any further thoughts? Nope. All right, fair enough. Okay, I can't see any further questions unless anybody wants to quickly jump in at this moment. Otherwise, maybe we can draw to a close and to say thanks to our wonderful panelists for a fantastic set of papers. It's been really enjoyable, and as I said, it's been an amazing way to kick off the CPAD conference, and it's set a very high bar for the rest of the panels today and tomorrow. And as is the norm on webinars, if everybody could express their thanks either through a little wave or, as I like to do, jazz hands. It's the only way I can communicate my pleasure with the work presented today. So thanks everybody. I'm sure there'll be lots of discussion via chat and follows up through email, whatnot, and so on. So thanks everybody.